The North had always been a cold and unforgiving land, but the year everything changed began with silence. Snow fell gently over the ancient towers of Winterfell, covering the stone walls like a quiet warning from the old gods. In this timeline, fate turned a little earlier than anyone expected. The young man named Ned Stark was only 17 when the burden of the North suddenly fell on his shoulders. His older brother, Brandon Stark, the fiery heir of House Stark, had ridden south to answer a grave insult from the crown prince. Normally, Brandon would return to rule beside their father, but the politics of the South were darker than the snows of the North. The Mad King, Aerys II Targaryen, had already begun to lose his grip on reason. His court was filled with whispers, spies, and fear. When Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding justice for his sister, he unknowingly walked into a trap. News traveled slowly to the north. For weeks, Rickard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, waited for word from the capital. Ravens came and went, but none carried the truth. Then one cold morning, a black bird finally arrived. The message it carried froze the blood of every man in the hall. Brandon Stark was imprisoned. The Mad King accused him of treason. Lord Rickard Stark immediately prepared to ride south to demand justice for his son. But before leaving, he made a decision that would change the future of the Seven Kingdoms. He called young Ned into the Great Hall. The torches burned quietly along the stone walls while northern lords gathered in silence. The atmosphere was heavy, as if even the old stones of Winterfell understood that something terrible was coming. Rickard Stark looked older than usual that day. "Ned," he said calmly, though his voice carried the weight of a storm, "until I return, the North will need a strong hand." The hall grew silent. Ned had spent most of his youth far away in the Vale, fostered under the Honourable Lord Jon Arryn at the Eyrie in the Vale. He was known as a quiet boy, honest, loyal, but never someone who expected power. Yet destiny rarely asked for permission. Rickard Stark continued, "I name you Warden of the North in my absence." The words echoed through the hall like thunder. Many of the northern lords exchanged surprised glances. Some wondered if a 17-year-old boy could truly command the loyalty of the entire North. But others knew something different about Ned Stark. Even at a young age, he carried the calm strength of the old kings of winter. Ned knelt before his father. "I will not fail the North," he said quietly. Rickard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember who you are. The North remembers honor when the South forgets it." That same day, Rickard Stark rode south with a small escort, determined to save his eldest son. But weeks later, another raven arrived. And this one carried horror. In King's Landing, the Mad King had burned Rickard Stark alive while forcing Brandon Stark to watch. Then Brandon was strangled, trying to save his father. The news shattered Winterfell. The Great Hall fell silent as the letter was read. Father and brother were both dead. 17-year-old Ned Stark was no longer acting warden. He was now Lord of Winterfell and true Warden of the North. Many lords expected chaos. A boy ruling the largest kingdom in Westeros seemed like weakness. But they underestimated Ned Stark. Instead of panic, he showed calm resolve. Within days, he summoned every great house of the North to Winterfell: House Manderly, House Karstark, House Umber, House Bolton, and many others. The Great Hall filled with hardened warriors. When Ned Stark stood before them, he looked young, but his voice carried the strength of the North itself. "The Mad King murdered my father and brother," he said. The room erupted in anger. But Ned raised his hand. "We will not act like fools. The North does not rush blindly into war." The lords quieted. Ned had already learned something important during his years with Jon Arryn in the Vale. War was not won by rage. It was won by preparation. Ravens flew from Winterfell in every direction. One went to Robert Baratheon in the Stormlands, another to Jon Arryn in the Vale. A quiet alliance was forming. But something else was happening too. By becoming Warden earlier, Ned Stark had more time. Time to gather armies. Time to strengthen alliances. Time to prepare the North for a war that was now inevitable. Far to the south, the Mad King believed he had crushed the Starks. He believed fear would keep the realm obedient. But in the frozen north, beneath the ancient weirwood trees of Winterfell, a young wolf had just taken command. And unlike in the original history of Game of Thrones, this time Ned Stark was not walking into the storm unprepared. He was already preparing the North for war. And when the banners of rebellion finally rose across Westeros, the North would be ready first. The days after the terrible news spread across Winterfell felt darker than any winter the North had seen in years. The death of Rickard Stark and Brandon Stark left a wound that every Northern lord could feel. But the young man now sitting in the high seat of the Great Hall, Eddard Ned Stark, did not allow grief to paralyze him. Instead, he worked day and night. The boy who once lived peacefully in the Vale had suddenly become the leader of the entire North, and he understood that every decision he made could determine the fate of thousands. Messengers rode through snow-covered roads, carrying Ned's orders to every corner of the North. Ravens flew endlessly between castles, bringing instructions and requests. The banners of the great northern houses slowly began to gather at Winterfell. Lords from House Umber, House Karstark, House Manderley, and even the quiet but dangerous men of House Bolton all answered the call. Some came out of loyalty to the Stark name, others came because the Mad King's cruelty had terrified them. If a king could burn a great lord alive in King's Landing, then no noble in Westeros was safe. Inside the Great Hall, Ned listened more than he spoke. Many older lords expected to guide or even control the young Warden of the North. They whispered among themselves that he was too young, too quiet, too honorable to survive the brutal politics of the realm. But as the meetings continued, they slowly realized something important. Ned Stark was not weak. His calm silence was not uncertainty, it was careful thinking. He spent hours speaking privately with his advisors and studying the strengths of every northern house. The North was vast and powerful, but it was also spread across enormous distances. If war came suddenly, gathering the entire northern army could take months. Ned understood this problem clearly. Instead of waiting for rebellion to explode, he began preparing the North quietly. Fortresses were reinforced. Food stores were increased in several major castles. Northern soldiers began training more frequently. Officially, it was only preparation for winter, but the truth was clear to anyone paying attention. The North was preparing for war. Meanwhile, ravens continued to fly south to the Vale. Ned wrote personally to his foster father, Jon Arryn. The letter carried painful news about Rickard and Brandon, but it also carried a warning. The Mad King had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Jon Arryn had always been a cautious and honorable man, but even he would struggle to remain loyal to a king capable of such madness. Another raven carried a message to Ned's closest friend, Robert Baratheon. Robert was known across the Seven Kingdoms for his strength, his laughter, and his fierce temper. The death of the Starks would strike him deeply, especially because of his love for Ned's sister, Lyanna. Ned knew that once Robert learned the truth, the Stormlands would not stay quiet for long. Weeks passed, and the snow continued to fall across the north. The army gathering around Winterfell slowly grew larger. Thousands of soldiers now camped outside the castle walls, their fires glowing through the cold nights like a sea of small stars. Many of these men had never met Ned before, yet they swore loyalty to him because of the name he carried. One evening, Ned walked alone through the godswood of Winterfell. The ancient heart tree watched silently as he stood before it. The red leaves of the weirwood moved gently in the wind, as if whispering the voices of old kings. In that quiet place, far from the noise of war preparations, Ned finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. His father was gone. His brother was gone. The future he once imagined had vanished completely. But the North could not afford a grieving boy. It needed a leader. and Ned Stark had already begun to become one. Far to the south, however, the Mad King remained convinced that fear would control the realm. In King's Landing, Aerys II Targaryen believed that the brutal execution of the Starks had destroyed any chance of rebellion. Instead of calming the kingdom, his actions were doing the opposite. Lords across Westeros were beginning to whisper, if the crown could murder one of the most honorable families in the realm, then no one was safe. The situation finally exploded when the king made another terrible mistake. He demanded that Jon Arryn hand over both Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon to the crown for execution. The order was simple, cruel, and completely unreasonable. Jon Arryn read the command in silence. Then he refused. With that single act, the rebellion that would shake Westeros finally began. But in this timeline, something was very different from the history people knew in Game of Thrones. Ned Stark was already prepared. His armies were already gathering. His alliances were already forming. The North was not scrambling to react. It was ready to march. And as thousands of northern soldiers prepared their weapons beneath the grey skis of Winterfell, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The young wolf of the North was no longer a boy trying to survive tragedy. He was a leader preparing to change the fate of the Seven Kingdoms forever. The declaration of rebellion spread across Westeros like wildfire carried by a harsh wind. What began as the cruel order of Aerys II Targaryen demanding the heads of Eddard, Ned Stark, and Robert Baratheon quickly turned into something far greater. When Jon Arryn publicly refused the king's command in the Vale, the fragile peace of the Seven Kingdoms finally shattered. The rebellion had begun. But unlike the history many knew from Game of Thrones, the North was not caught unprepared. For months, Ned Stark had quietly gathered strength at Winterfell. His armies were already organized, his bannermen already sworn, and his plans already forming. When the Raven arrived confirming Jon Arryn's rebellion, Ned did not hesitate. Within hours, the great war horns of Winterfell echoed across the snowy fields. The North would march. Thousands of soldiers assembled beneath the grey northern sky. Banners of the direwolf flew proudly beside the sigils of many great houses. The fierce giants of House Umber, the disciplined warriors of House Karstark, the wealthy forces of House Manderly, and the cold, calculating men of House Bolton all stood ready. It was one of the largest northern armies gathered in generations. Many of the older lords watched Ned carefully. He was still young, barely a man by their standards. But when he rode out from the gates of Winterfell, wearing the grey cloak of House Stark, mounted on a tall warhorse, the doubts slowly faded. There was a quiet authority in him that reminded them of the old kings in the north. Before the army departed, Ned stood before his soldiers and spoke only a few words. "The Mad King murdered my father and brother," he said calmly. "He believes fear will rule the realm. Today we remind him that the North kneels to no tyrant." The soldiers answered with a thunderous roar that rolled across the frozen fields. Soon after, the long march south began. The journey was slow and difficult. The North was enormous, and moving such a massive army through snow and forest took careful planning. Yet Ned used this time wisely. Each night he met with his commanders, discussing strategy and preparing for the battles that would soon come. He had learned much from his years under Jon Arryn, and now he began to show a talent for leadership that many had not expected. Meanwhile, far to the south, chaos was already spreading. Robert Baratheon had raised his banners in the Stormlands. Known for his strength and unmatched skill in battle, Robert quickly gathered thousands of warriors who were eager to challenge the crown. His anger burned fiercely, especially after learning about the deaths of the Starks and the disappearance of Lyanna Stark. For Robert, the war had become deeply personal. The forces of the crown, however, were still powerful. The Targaryen dynasty had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, and many great houses remained loyal. Among them were the mighty armies of Tywin Lannister in the Westerlands and the proud knights serving Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. For a time, it seemed the rebellion might be crushed quickly. But Ned Stark's early preparations were about to change the balance. By the time the Northern Army reached the southern borders of their kingdom, scouts were already bringing reports of royal forces moving toward the Riverlands. Instead of marching blindly forward, Ned paused to study the situation. He gathered his bannermen in a war council and carefully explained his strategy. Rather than rushing into one massive battle, the Northern Army would move in several coordinated groups. Smaller forces would secure important crossings and supply routes, while the main army advanced toward the Riverlands to meet Robert Baratheon's forces. This careful planning surprised many of the older commanders. They had expected the young Warden to rely only on courage and northern stubbornness. Instead, he was showing patience and intelligence. As the weeks passed, the Northern Army finally crossed into the lands of the Riverlands. The region was already suffering from the early chaos of the rebellion. Small battles had broken out, villages had been burned, and frightened people watched nervously as thousands of northern soldiers marched through their lands. Yet the arrival of Ned Stark also brought hope. Many lords of the Riverlands had grown uneasy under the rule of the Mad King. When they saw the disciplined army of the North arriving under the banner of House Stark, they began to believe the rebellion might actually succeed. Soon, word reached Ned that Robert Baratheon himself was marching north to meet him. The two old friends had not seen each other since the tragedy began. But now they would meet again, not as carefree young men raised in peace, but as leaders of a war that would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. And as the Northern Army continued its march through the Riverlands, one truth was becoming clear to everyone involved. This rebellion was no longer just a desperate reaction to the Mad King's cruelty. With Ned Stark prepared months earlier than in the original history, the rebels were stronger, better organized, and far more dangerous. The wolves of the North had entered the war early. And soon, the dragons of the Crown would learn just how deadly that mistake would be. The Northern Army moved steadily through the Riverlands, their banners cutting through the cold wind like dark wings against the grey sky. Villagers and smallfolk watched nervously from the edges of roads as thousands of armored soldiers marched south under the direwolf of Winterfell. Many had never seen such a force from the north before. Yet despite the fear that always followed armies, Ned Stark had given strict orders that no villages were to be harmed and no supplies taken without fair payment. It was a small thing in the chaos of war, but it quickly spread word among the people that the Northern Army was different from many others. At the center of this growing force rode Eddard, Ned Stark. The young lord had spent the long march learning the rhythms of command. Each day brought new reports from scouts, messengers from allied lords, and rumors from the south. War was messy and unpredictable, yet Ned continued to approach every problem with patience and calm thinking. The older commanders who had once doubted him now found themselves respecting the quiet strength he carried. One afternoon, as the Northern Army prepared to camp near a wide river crossing, a group of riders approached quickly from the south. Their horses were exhausted, and their banners carried the crowned stag of Robert Baratheon. Ned rode forward to meet them. Moments later, a familiar booming laugh echoed across the field. Robert Baratheon himself rode at the front of the group, large and powerful even in heavy armor. His black beard had grown wild, and his eyes burned with the energy of a man who had already tasted battle. When Robert saw Ned clearly, he dismounted and walked forward quickly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The last time they had stood together, they were young men training in the peaceful halls of the Eyrie under the guidance of Jon Arryn. Back then, their biggest worries had been tournaments, training swords, and long nights of drinking. Now they were leaders of a rebellion. Robert finally broke the silence and pulled Ned into a powerful embrace. "Gods, Ned," Robert said with a rough voice, "I heard what the Mad King did to your father and brother. I swear he'll answer for it." Ned nodded quietly. His grief had settled deep inside him, no longer burning like fresh anger, but shaping every decision he made. "He will," Ned replied calmly, "but we must win the war first." Robert studied his friend for a moment. Noticing how much he had changed, The quiet boy he once knew had become something steadier, stronger. "You've grown into a proper lord, it seems," Robert said with a half-smile. "And you've become exactly the warrior everyone feared you would be," Ned answered. Soon after their reunion, the two commanders gathered their officers and began planning the next phase of the rebellion. Their combined forces were now massive. The Northern Army and the Stormlands soldiers together created a powerful host that could challenge almost any royal force. But danger was already approaching. Scouts reported that royal troops loyal to the crown were moving north to stop the rebels before they could gather even more support. Among these forces were knights and soldiers loyal to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, who had finally returned from his mysterious absence. The prince was known as a brilliant warrior and strategist. Many believed that if anyone could save the crumbling Targaryen dynasty, it would be him. Ned understood that their rebellion would face its greatest tests soon. That night, a large war council was held inside a massive command tent lit by dozens of torches. Maps of the Riverlands were spread across a wooden table while commanders argued over the best strategy. Some wanted to push south immediately toward King's Landing. Others believed they should remain defensive and force the royal armies to attack first. Ned listened carefully to every argument before finally speaking. "If we rush forward blindly, we risk fighting the entire royal army at once," he said calmly. "But if we move carefully and choose our battlefield, we can weaken them before the final battle." Robert leaned against the table, arms crossed. "So what do you suggest, Ned?" Ned pointed to a narrow crossing along the river marked on the map. "If we hold this position, the royal army will have no choice but to meet us here. Their numbers will mean less in such tight ground." The commanders studied the map. Slowly, many began to nod in agreement. Robert grinned widely. "Gods, Ned, you're becoming a proper war leader." The plan was quickly approved. Over the next few days, rebel forces moved into position near the crossing. Soldiers built defensive lines, archers prepared their positions, and scouts kept watch for any movement from the royal army. Soon enough, the reports arrived. A large royal force was marching directly toward them. The first major battle of the rebellion was about to begin. As the rebel army prepared for war beneath the darkening sky, Ned Stark stood quietly beside Robert Baratheon, overlooking the river. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "By this time tomorrow, half of us may be dead." Ned looked across the water, where the enemy would soon appear. "Then we make sure the other half wins," he said calmly. The rebellion had begun with anger and tragedy. But now, with armies facing each other across the river, the true test was about to begin. And the young Warden of the North was about to fight his first great battle, one that would decide whether the rebellion would rise or fall. The night before the battle was long and restless for the rebel army. Thousands of soldiers camped along the riverbanks in the cold lands of the Riverlands. Fires burned across the dark fields like scattered stars, and the sound of sharpening steel and quiet prayers filled the night air. Everyone knew that by sunrise, many of them would face death. At the center of the camp stood the command tent where Eddard, Ned Stark, and Robert Baratheon studied the battlefield one last time. The river crossing ahead was narrow, just as Ned had planned. If the royal army tried to push through it in large numbers, they would be forced into tight formations where their advantage in size would mean little. Robert seemed eager for the fight. He paced back and forth inside the tent like a caged animal, gripping the heavy warhammer that had already become famous among his soldiers. "I hope they come quickly," Robert muttered. "The waiting is worse than the fighting." Ned stood calmly beside the table, examining the map once more. "They will come," he said quietly. "The Crown cannot allow us to unite the Riverlands and the North. If they stop us here, the rebellion dies." Robert laughed loudly. "Then let them try." Outside the tent, the soldiers of the North prepared themselves in their own ways. Some sharpened swords or repaired shields, while others sat quietly remembering their homes. Many of them had followed the Stark banners all their lives, but this was different. This war was not just about loyalty. It was about justice for the brutal deaths ordered by Aerys II Targaryen. As the first light of morning began to appear over the distant hills, horns suddenly sounded from the rebel scouts. The royal army had arrived. Across the river, thousands of armored soldiers slowly appeared along the opposite bank. Their banners carried the three-headed dragon of the Targaryens, fluttering proudly in the cold wind. Rows of knights, archers, and infantry stretched far across the fields. The rebels watched in silence. Even Robert grew quiet for a moment as he studied the enemy. "Well," he finally said, lifting his hammer onto his shoulder, "looks like the dragon still has teeth." Ned gave quick orders to his commanders. Archers took their positions along the defensive lines, while infantry formed tight shield walls guarding the narrow crossing. Northern soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. For several long minutes, neither side moved. Then the war horns of the royal army echoed across the battlefield. The first wave of royal soldiers began marching toward the river crossing. Arrows flew almost immediately. Rebel archers released volleys that darkened the sky, forcing the advancing soldiers to raise their shields. Several men fell before even reaching the water, but the royal army continued forward with disciplined determination. Soon the first enemy troops splashed into the shallow river, struggling through the cold current while holding their weapons high. "Hold the line," Ned ordered calmly. The rebel infantry remained still, shields locked together as they waited for the enemy to climb the riverbank. When the royal soldiers finally reached solid ground, the clash began. Steel crashed against steel as the first lines collided. The tight battlefield turned the fight into brutal close combat, where skill and strength mattered more than numbers. Northern warriors fought fiercely, many of them hardened by years of harsh winters and border skirmishes. In the center of the line, Robert Baratheon charged forward like a storm. His massive hammer crushed shields and armor with terrifying force, sending royal soldiers flying backward. Each swing created space for the rebel line to push forward. Ned fought nearby with his sword, moving with controlled precision. Unlike Robert's wild power, Ned's style was calm and efficient. He focused on maintaining the battle line, constantly watching the movements of both armies. From a nearby hill, rebel commanders signaled the next phase of Ned's plan. Hidden groups of northern soldiers suddenly appeared along the flanks of the battlefield. They had been waiting in the forests during the early stages of the fight. Now they attacked the royal forces from the sides, disrupting their formations. The royal commanders had not expected this. Their soldiers were now trapped between the narrow river crossing and the disciplined rebel lines. Confusion quickly spread through the royal ranks. Seeing the moment of weakness, Robert shouted a thunderous command. "Push forward!" The rebel army surged ahead with renewed strength. Northern warriors roared as they drove the royal troops back toward the river. Many enemy soldiers stumbled into the water while trying to retreat, creating chaos behind their own lines. Within an hour, the battle was decided. The surviving royal troops began a full retreat across the river, leaving behind dozens of fallen banners and broken weapons. Cheers erupted across the rebel camp. The first major battle of the rebellion had ended in victory. As the fighting stopped, Ned Stark stood quietly on the battlefield, watching the last of the royal soldiers disappear into the distance. Around him, wounded men were being carried away, while others gathered the fallen. Robert walked over, his armor dented but his grin wide. "Well, Ned," he said proudly, "looks like your careful planning works just fine." Ned looked across the river thoughtfully. "This was only the beginning," he replied. Robert nodded. They both knew the truth. Defeating a royal force in one battle was important, but the true war had only just begun. Somewhere in the south, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was gathering the full strength of the crown. And when that army finally marched north, the rebellion would face its greatest challenge yet. But one thing was now certain across all of Westeros. The rebels were not weak, and the young Warden of the North had just proven that he was far more dangerous than anyone expected. News of the rebel victory spread quickly across Westeros. What had started as whispers of rebellion now turned into something far more serious. Lords across the Seven Kingdoms began to realize that the uprising led by Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark was not going to collapse easily. The battle at the river crossing had proven that the rebels were organized, disciplined, and capable of defeating royal forces in open battle. In the rebel camp along the riverbanks of the Riverlands, soldiers celebrated their victory, but their leaders remained cautious. Ned Stark refused to allow the army to grow careless. He ordered the wounded to be treated immediately and the defenses strengthened. Scouts were sent in every direction to watch for enemy movements. Victory was encouraging, but Ned understood that the crown still possessed far greater resources. Robert Baratheon, however, seemed more energized than ever. Each day he trained with his soldiers, laughing loudly and boasting that the dragon banners would soon fall. His fearless confidence inspired the men, but Ned often balanced Robert's enthusiasm with careful planning. One evening, as the rebel commanders gathered inside the war tent, a messenger arrived with urgent news from the south. The rider was exhausted, his horse barely able to stand after the long journey. He delivered a sealed message directly to Ned. The letter carried troubling information. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had finally taken full command of the royal armies. Unlike his father, Aerys II Targaryen, Rhaegar was known for his intelligence and calm leadership. Many nobles who had been uneasy under the Mad King still respected the prince. With Rhaegar leading the royal forces, the war was about to become far more dangerous for the rebels. Robert read the message and frowned. "So the Dragon Prince finally steps onto the battlefield," he said. Ned nodded slowly. Rhaegar is not like his father. He will not rush blindly into battle. The commanders around the table exchanged uneasy looks. They all knew Rhaegar's reputation. He was not only a skilled warrior, but also a careful strategist. Many believed he could unite the loyalist houses and crush the rebellion if given enough time. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the Mad King continued sinking deeper into paranoia. He suspected betrayal everywhere, even among his own supporters. While Rhaegar prepared the royal armies for war, Aerys filled the capital with fear, ordering new defenses and punishing anyone he believed might support the rebels. But Rhaegar understood something his father did not. The rebellion could not simply be frightened away. It had to be defeated on the battlefield. Soon the prince gathered a massive army from loyal houses across the southern kingdoms. Knights from the Reach, soldiers from the Crownlands, and experienced commanders from many noble families joined his banners. Their destination was clear. They would march north to crush the rebellion once and for all. Back in the rebel camp, Ned Stark studied the growing reports with deep concern. The royal army gathering under Rhaegar was far larger than the force they had just defeated. If the rebels faced that army unprepared, their earlier victory would mean nothing. Once again, Ned called for a war council. Inside the tent, maps covered the table as commanders discussed their options. Some argued that the rebels should advance quickly toward King's Landing before Rhaegar could fully assemble his forces. Others believed they should remain in the Riverlands and force the royal army to attack them. Robert leaned forward with excitement. "I say we meet the prince head-on," he said boldly. "One battle between us and this war ends." Many soldiers supported Robert's confidence. He was already becoming a legend among the rebels. But Ned remained thoughtful. "Rhaegar will not make the same mistakes as the commanders we faced before," he said calmly. "If we rush into battle on his terms, we may lose everything." The tent grew quiet as the leaders waited for Ned's conclusion. After a moment, He pointed to a location marked along a wide river in the south of the Riverlands. If Rhaegar marches north, he will likely cross here, Ned explained. The terrain will force both armies into a narrow front. If we prepare the battlefield carefully, we can match his numbers with discipline and positioning. Robert studied the map and slowly nodded. A good place for a proper fight, he admitted. The decision was made. The rebel army would move south to prepare for what would likely become the greatest battle of the war. Over the following weeks, thousands of rebel soldiers marched across the Riverlands toward the chosen battlefield. Along the way, more lords joined their cause, encouraged by their earlier victory. The rebellion was growing stronger with every passing day. Yet far in the distance, another army was moving as well. Under the silver dragon banners of House Targaryen, Prince Rhaegar's massive host marched north. Experienced knights rode beside seasoned commanders, all determined to restore order to the realm. Two great armies were now moving toward the same river. Everyone across Westeros could feel that the coming battle would decide the future of the Seven Kingdoms. As the rebel army finally reached the wide waters of the Trident, Ned Stark stood beside Robert Baratheon once again, watching the distant horizon. Robert gripped his hammer tightly. "Soon we face the dragon himself," he said. Ned looked out across the river, where their enemy would soon appear. "Yes," he replied quietly, "and when that battle comes, the fate of the realm will be decided." The war had grown larger than revenge or rebellion. Now it was becoming a fight for the future of all of Westeros. And the greatest battle of the age was about to begin. The air along the banks of the Trident felt heavy with tension as both armies finally arrived. Thousands of soldiers covered the fields on either side of the wide river. The banners of the rebellion, direwolves, crowned stags, and many other sigils fluttered together in the wind. Across the water, the silver and red dragons of House Targaryen stood proudly above the massive royal army led by Rhaegar Targaryen. For several days, both forces watched each other carefully. Scouts moved constantly between camps while commanders studied the land, searching for any advantage. It was clear to everyone that this battle would decide the fate of the war. If the rebels won, the road to King's Landing would open. If they lost, the rebellion would collapse. In the rebel camp, Ned Stark continued organizing the army with his usual calm focus. The battlefield at the Trident was large and dangerous, but Ned carefully arranged the rebel forces so they could hold strong against the royal army's numbers. Archers were placed along high ground, infantry formed thick shield walls near the riverbanks, and cavalry waited behind the main lines, ready to charge when the right moment came. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon grew impatient with each passing day. War was in his blood, and the waiting only fueled his anger toward the Targaryens. One evening, as the sun began setting over the river, Robert stood beside Ned, watching the distant dragon banners. "Somewhere across that water stands the man who started all of this," Robert said, his voice heavy with emotion. "If not for him, Lyanna would still be safe." Ned did not answer immediately. The mystery surrounding Lyanna Stark weighed heavily on him as well. No one truly knew what had happened between her and Prince Rhaegar, but the war had grown far beyond that single event. "Tomorrow we fight," Ned finally said quietly. Robert nodded, gripping his warhammer with determination. "Yes, and tomorrow I end the dragon's line." At dawn the next morning, war horns echoed across the river as both armies began preparing for battle. The royal army moved first, forming long disciplined ranks under the command of Rhaegar and his experienced generals. The prince himself wore shining armor decorated with a ruby-studded breastplate that glowed red beneath the rising sun. Across the field, the rebel forces answered the challenge. Robert rode along the front lines, shouting encouragement to his soldiers. His voice carried across the battlefield, filling the men with fierce energy. Many of them had followed him through earlier battles and trusted him completely. Ned remained near the center of the formation, calmly directing the movement of the army. His role was not to charge recklessly, but to ensure the rebel lines held firm when the fighting began. Soon the two armies began advancing toward each other. The ground shook beneath thousands of marching soldiers. Drums beat loudly while horns sounded again and again. Archers prepared their bows as the distance between the forces slowly closed. Then the first arrows flew. Dark clouds of arrows filled the sky as both sides launched their opening attacks. Men fell across the battlefield before the armies even reached each other, but neither side slowed down. Moments later, the massive lines of infantry finally collided. The sound of steel crashing against steel echoed across the Trident as thousands of soldiers fought in brutal close combat. Shields splintered, swords clashed, and war cries filled the air. The battle quickly turned chaotic as both sides struggled to push the other back. In the center of the rebel line, Robert Baratheon charged directly into the thickest fighting. His enormous hammer smashed through enemy shields and armor with terrifying force. Royal soldiers tried to surround him, but Robert fought like a storm, cutting a path through the battlefield. Soon word spread that Prince Rhaegar himself had entered the fight. The prince rode at the head of the royal cavalry, his silver armor shining among the chaos of battle. Wherever he rode, the royal soldiers rallied with renewed determination. It did not take long for Robert to hear the news. When he spotted the dragon prince across the battlefield, his eyes burned with fury. "There he is," Robert shouted. Ignoring the chaos around him, Robert forced his way forward through the fighting. Soldiers from both sides were pushed aside as the two warriors slowly moved toward each other across the bloody field. Ned Stark saw what was happening from a distance. He knew that if Robert fell, the rebellion might collapse instantly, but he also understood that nothing could stop Robert now. At last, the two leaders faced each other in the shallow waters of the river. Rhaegar Targaryen raised his sword calmly, while Robert lifted his heavy warhammer. For a brief moment, the battlefield around them seemed to fade away. Then the duel began. Rhaegar struck first with quick, precise sword attacks, but Robert answered with powerful swings of his hammer that shook the water around them. The two warriors fought fiercely, each representing the fate of their entire cause. The clash continued for several intense moments. Then Robert saw his chance. With a mighty roar, he brought his hammer down in a devastating strike that shattered Rhaegar's armor. The rubies decorating the prince's breastplate exploded into the river as he fell beneath the water. The dragon prince was dead. Across the battlefield, the royal army saw their leader fall. Within minutes, their formations began collapsing. What followed was chaos as royal soldiers began retreating in panic, while the rebel army pushed forward with renewed strength. By sunset, the Battle of the Trident was over. The rebellion had won its greatest victory. As the surviving soldiers gathered along the riverbank, Ned Stark stood quietly beside Robert Baratheon, watching the water flow past the scattered rubies that still glittered beneath the surface. The dragon had fallen, but the war was not quite finished. Because far to the south, the Mad King still sat upon the Iron Throne in King's Landing. And soon, the rebel army would march to end the Targaryen rule forever. The rebel army did not rest long after the Battle of the Trident. News of Rhaegar Targaryen's death spread like wildfire across Westeros, sending waves of fear through the remaining loyalist forces. Yet Ned Stark understood that the greatest challenge still lay ahead. The Mad King himself, Aerys II Targaryen, still sat upon the Iron Throne in King's Landing, surrounded by fanatical supporters and deadly city defenses. Any assault would be far more dangerous than the open-field battles the rebels had fought so far, and the young Warden of the North knew that preparation and strategy would be as crucial as courage. The army moved swiftly south through the riverlands, stopping only briefly to secure key towns and fortresses along the way. Ned personally oversaw each advance, ensuring that supply lines remained intact and morale stayed high. He rode alongside Robert Baratheon, whose boundless energy and fearlessness inspired the troops. yet even Robert deferred to Ned's tactical guidance. The balance between Robert's brute strength and Ned's calculated mind created a force that no loyalist army could easily predict or counter. As the rebels approached the outskirts of King's Landing, scouts reported that the city was on high alert. The Mad King had fortified the walls with fire traps and hidden soldiers, and rumors circulated of caches of wildfire stored beneath the streets. Despite the danger, Ned insisted on approaching cautiously. He knew that rushing blindly into the city could result in disaster, even for an army as large and battle-hardened as theirs. The two commanders held a council beneath the shade of a grove outside the city walls. Robert's impatience was obvious. He wanted to storm the gates immediately, but Ned continued to outline a careful strategy. They would split the forces. One group would feint an attack on the main gates to draw out defenders, while a smaller, elite strike force would infiltrate the city through a lesser-known gate. Meanwhile, archers and northern infantry would hold key positions to prevent loyalists from regrouping. Every detail was considered. Every move was timed. As night fell, the rebel army prepared for the first stage of the assault. Fires were set to signal the start, and hidden soldiers moved into their positions silently. The tension was unbearable. Thousands of men waited in the darkness, listening to the faint sounds of the city stirring beyond the walls. For many, it was the first time they would fight within the streets of a major city rather than in open fields. Fear mixed with anticipation, and the soldiers' breaths hung in the cold night air. Ned walked along the lines, speaking quietly to commanders and soldiers alike. He reminded them that their actions would determine the future of Westeros. "Hold your courage steady," he said softly. "Think before you strike. Every life matters, and every choice matters. This is the moment the North remembers." His calm voice carried an authority that steadied nerves and brought focus to the men who would soon face the chaos of the city. In the distance, the walls of King's Landing loomed like a giant shadow. Torches flickered along the battlements, and occasional shouts from sentries could be heard even from the rebel camp. The city seemed almost alive, watching the army gather outside with a mixture of defiance and fear. Ned understood that this battle would not be won by strength alone. It would require patience, cunning, and precise timing. Robert, packing impatiently, finally turned to Ned. "I do not like waiting," he said. "If we do not strike soon, they will strengthen every wall and tower. I want this city taken before dawn." Ned shook his head slowly. "If we rush, we risk every soldier we've trained and every advantage we hold. Timing is everything. We wait until we are ready." Even as they spoke, hidden parties of Northern and Stormland soldiers crept closer to the secret gate that would serve as the strike force's entry point. Night shadows concealed their movement, but Ned's sharp eyes tracked every step. The city beyond the walls remained tense, its guards unaware that a silent storm was approaching. The first fires in the outer districts were lit as a signal to begin the feint. Arrows flew from the northern lines toward the walls, drawing out the city defenders. Meanwhile, the strike force slipped through the gate and entered the winding streets beyond. Ned watched carefully, knowing that once the rebels were inside, the city itself would become a chaotic battlefield. Every street corner, every building, every alley could turn into a trap. The sounds of battle slowly began to rise from the city, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, and the occasional roar of a wounded warrior. Even from outside the walls, Ned could see the fires spreading through the outer districts, consuming structures and forcing loyalist troops to react. The plan was working, but the danger was far from over. From his position near the faint lines, Robert let out a booming laugh as he raised his hammer. "The city bends to the wolf and stag," he shouted, but Ned did not smile. He kept his focus on the streets beyond the secret gate, watching the battle unfold like a chessboard, aware that one misstep could turn victory into disaster. The rebels had taken the first step into King's Landing, but Ned knew that the true test of leadership and of survival was only just beginning. The streets were narrow, the loyalists were desperate, and the flames of wildfire hidden beneath the city threatened to turn the battle into a deadly trap. Every choice made now could decide the fate of the rebellion and of Westeros itself. The streets of King's Landing were a maze of shadows and flickering torchlight as the rebel strike force moved cautiously through the alleys. Soldiers hugged walls, checking every corner, wary of ambushes. Fires from the faint outside illuminated the night, casting grotesque shadows across the city walls. Many loyalist soldiers had abandoned the outer districts in panic, but small groups of defenders still lurked, waiting to strike anyone who faltered. Every step forward was tense, every sound a potential threat. Ned Stark had not entered the city himself. He remained near the main rebel force outside the walls, coordinating with commanders via messengers and scouts. From his vantage point, he could see both the chaos of the inner streets and the Faint attacking the gates. It was a delicate balance. The Faint had to draw enough attention to prevent loyalists from reinforcing the secret gate, but it could not overextend itself or risk too many men before the strike force secured a foothold. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon roared with every clash at the Faint lines. His hammer struck down anyone who came too close, sending soldiers fleeing in fear and awe. The rebels outside the walls gained ground steadily, but Robert's booming voice reminded everyone that their energy and morale were just as important as their strategy. "Push them back. The crown bends only when struck with strength," he shouted, laughing even as smoke and flames swirled around him. Inside the city, the strike force faced a far more dangerous situation. Narrow streets forced men to fight in cramped conditions, where a single loyalist soldier could delay dozens of rebels. Ned had anticipated this and ensured that the most disciplined soldiers formed the vanguard. Their cohesion allowed them to push through the first line of city defenders, taking control of key intersections and buildings. Every captured building became a temporary fortress from which archers could rain arrows down on loyalists further along the streets. Word quickly reached Ned outside that the strike force had taken control of the central district. He allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction, but did not relax. He knew the Mad King could be anywhere, watching, and the city held dangerous surprises of its own: wildfire caches hidden beneath streets, loyalist snipers, and sudden barricades that could trap advancing rebels. Every decision now could save lives or cost them. Robert, sensing the shift in momentum, charged again at the gates, smashing down barricades while the northern infantry held a steady line. The rebels outside and inside the city began to feel the tide turning in their favor, but Ned reminded everyone to remain disciplined. "No overconfidence," he warned his commanders. "The city is alive, and it will fight back at every corner." From his vantage point near the river, Ned could see smoke rising from several parts of the city and the faint glow of torches moving in the streets. Messages flew quickly between commanders, coordinating the push deeper into King's Landing. Each neighborhood secured allowed more soldiers to advance, but the risk increased with every step. Loyalist defenders fought desperately, knowing their king's survival, and perhaps their own lives, depended on holding ground. Ned also received troubling news. A detachment of loyalist forces had discovered one of the northern supply lines outside the city. Though small in number, they threatened to cut reinforcements and create panic among the rear guard. Ned quickly dispatched cavalry to intercept them, ensuring that the city assault would continue without interruption. His ability to manage both fronts, inside the city and across the surrounding approaches, kept the rebels coordinated despite the chaos. As the night deepened, the fighting inside King's Landing intensified. Fires spread from building to building, and the streets became a confusing labyrinth of smoke, noise, and danger. Every alley turned into a trap or a battlefield, and even the most seasoned soldiers found themselves facing unexpected resistance. The strike force pressed on, capturing key landmarks, but they knew the center of the city, and the Mad King himself still waited ahead. Ned Stark's careful planning had brought the rebels this far, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. The city's heart held loyalist forces he could not yet see, and every step forward risked triggering traps that could destroy his army. From outside the walls, he watched the fires and listened to the distant screams, knowing that this battle would test every ounce of discipline, courage, and leadership he possessed. Flames flickered through the narrow streets of King's Landing, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts against the stone walls. The strike force moved cautiously, their boots echoing on the cobblestones as they advanced toward the heart of the city. Loyalist soldiers, desperate and cunning, had begun using the alleys to their advantage, launching sudden attacks from above windows and behind barricades. Each skirmish slowed the rebels' progress, forcing Ned's soldiers to stay alert with every step. The streets were alive with danger, and a single misstep could trap dozens in a deadly crossfire. Outside, Ned Stark continued to oversee the broader battle. He coordinated archers along rooftops, positioned infantry to guard the flanks, and kept the faint lines pressing at the city gates. Messages flew on raven wings and by horse riders, carrying information about troop movements inside the streets. Ned's mind was a constant whirl of strategy, calculating timing, positioning, and contingencies. One wrong call now could undo weeks of careful preparation. Robert Baratheon, meanwhile, fought like a whirlwind at the front of the feint. Every strike of his hammer sent loyalist soldiers sprawling backward, but the longer the fighting continued, the more aware he became that the battle inside the city would not be quick. The cries of men, the smell of smoke, and the chaos of fire growing along the streets reminded him that this was not the open field where strength alone ruled. Yet he thrived in chaos, and his presence bolstered the morale of every soldier nearby. Inside King's Landing, the strike force reached a wider square. From this vantage, the rebels could see the city's inner walls rising ahead, guarded by loyalist soldiers who had regrouped after the initial chaos. Fires still burned in nearby buildings, and smoke choked the air, making every step uncertain. Northern soldiers advanced carefully, using buildings as cover, while archers on rooftops picked off enemy leaders. Each small victory brought them closer to the heart of the city, but resistance grew stronger at every turn. Ned received reports that loyalist forces were setting traps along the main thoroughfares, hidden pits, barricades reinforced with spikes, and even signs of small wildfire caches stored in cellars. The Mad King's paranoia had turned the city itself into a weapon. Ned frowned, realizing that the rebels would need to proceed even more cautiously if they wanted to survive the next stage of the battle. Cavalry sent to flank the city gates ran into unexpected resistance, forcing Ned to redirect reinforcements. He barked orders to his commanders, moving his forces like pieces on a chessboard. Every decision required precision, every misstep could lead to disaster. Even Robert, fearless as he was, deferred to Ned's judgment in these tense moments. Meanwhile, the loyalists inside the city were growing desperate. Word spread quickly that the strike force had made significant gains, and panic began to ripple through the defenders. Yet the remaining soldiers were determined to fight to the death. Barricades were reinforced, corners were heavily guarded, and narrow streets were turned into choke points where even the bravest rebel soldiers had to fight tooth and nail to survive. From his position overseeing the battlefield, Ned could see smoke rising from multiple districts and hear the distant clash of steel and screams of men. Every messenger that returned with news brought updates of both success and danger. The rebels were advancing, but they were still deep within hostile territory, with traps and loyalist forces lurking at every turn. As the night wore on, fires spread further, lighting the streets with a red-orange glow. Rebel soldiers were now in constant motion, moving cautiously but steadily deeper into the city. The loyalists, sensing the inevitability of their losses, became more unpredictable and aggressive, striking suddenly from rooftops, basements, and alleyways. Each moment required vigilance, and Ned Stark knew that the battle would test not just courage, but leadership, foresight, and discipline to its limits. Even as the rebels pushed forward, the Mad King remained in King's Landing. The streets of King's Landing were a chaotic storm of smoke, fire, and clashing steel as the rebel forces pressed deeper into the city. Northern soldiers moved cautiously through narrow alleys while archers fired from rooftops, their arrows cutting down loyalists who had once thought they held the advantage. Fires spread from building to building, creating walls of heat and light that illuminated the desperate struggle below. Ned Stark remained at the center of the battlefield, coordinating movements with calm precision. Every messenger that reached him brought updates of rebel units advancing or encountering traps set by the Mad King. Hidden caches of wildfire had forced portions of the army to change course, but Ned's careful planning and foresight allowed them to continue pressing forward. Robert Baratheon, as ever, led the charge where the fighting was fiercest, smashing through barricades with brute force and rallying the soldiers around him. Despite the chaos, the rebels steadily gained ground. Key intersections were secured, and loyalist forces began to falter under the combined pressure of disciplined strategy and relentless aggression. Smoke and fire created confusion, making it difficult for defenders to coordinate, and the sight of Northern and Stormland soldiers moving methodically through the city struck fear into the hearts of even the most loyal men. From a high vantage point, Ned watched the progress carefully. He knew that the city still held many dangers, hidden loyalist troops, trapped streets, and the ever-present threat of wildfire, but the momentum was now clearly on the side of the rebellion. Each captured building and cleared street brought them closer to the Red Keep, where the Mad King waited, unseen and dangerous. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight cut through the smoke-filled streets. The rebels had pushed into the heart of King's Landing, but the battle was far from over. The city itself was still a deadly maze, and the Mad King's cunning remained a threat. Yet the rebellion had achieved what few believed possible. They had turned the tide, shattered loyalist morale, and claimed control of most of the city's districts. Ned Stark rode along the front lines, quietly ensuring that the army held its discipline. Soldiers cheered as they cleared another barricade, and Robert laughed, raising his warhammer in triumph. The city was nearly in their hands, but Ned knew that victory required patience, strategy, and unwavering focus until the final confrontation. The rebel army now stood at the threshold of the Red Keep. Fires burned around the city, loyalist forces were scattered and desperate, and the roar of battle echoed off the walls. For the first time, it seemed possible that the Seven Kingdoms might finally be free from the tyranny of the Mad King. Ned took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every life in the city and every choice that had led them to this moment. The next steps would determine not only the fate of King's Landing, but the future of all Westeros. And with that, the stage was set for the final confrontation.